Do I just do it here? Welcome, everyone. Welcome. I'm Oyèrónkẹ from the University of Color. We are an action group that came about during the Maagdenhuis protests in 2015. And, well, actually, you are kind of in a teach-in right now. So welcome. It's a series called sorry, I'm a bit thrown off, but this teaching series is aimed at turning the mirror on yourself and interrogating why you like something, why you like to research something, and why you like to do something in your activism, in your daily life. And I invite you to follow us and the series and to come to our events. We are organizing on campus and off campus with Africadelic, the University of Color, and our partners. And it is made possible by NICA and ASCA, the Netherlands Institute for Cultural Analysis and the Research School for Cultural Analysis. Today we have a special occasion, the lecture by Professor Oyèrónkẹ Oyěwùmí. I am very happy that we were able to pull this off together. And also thank you to SPY 25 that we were able to host this event here. So I will now give the floor to Shahana, the moderator of this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda, for being the force of nature that you are and making all of this happen. I want to give another big round of applause to Amanda. Without her, this would not have happened. I will, of course, be introducing our honorable speaker today, but before I do that, I will also be introducing the panelists whose names and whose little bios that I have. I will be saying out later, but right now I also wanted to say that we will also have Linda Musariri, Amanda Mokone, and Grace Nachako, who will be coming up later on. But before that, I'm extremely honored and humbled to be introducing Professor Oyèrónkẹ Oyěwùmí, one of the path-breaking and path-creating thinkers and social scientists of our time. Professor Oyèwùmí is a professor of sociology, specializing in gender, knowledge, and culture at Stony Brook University, USA. A scholar of Nigerian origin, her research spans colonial and post-colonial studies, modernities, and African studies. Her seminal work, The Invention of Women, Making an African Sense of Western Gender Discourses, which was published in 1997. If you have the book, come and get it signed later on, which shows that the concept of gender is not omnipresent and that imposing it as such had devastating colonial effects, has had a profound impact on fields such as sociology, cultural anthropology, decolonial theory, and African, cultural, and of course, gender studies. Her writings are widely studied in humanities and social sciences courses, including in the Netherlands. Her other books include African Women and Feminism, reflecting on the politics of sisterhood and what gender is motherhood, and recently she co-edited Naming Africans on the epistemic value of names. We are thrilled to have Professor Oyèwùmí with us today. Her talk, Disrupting Colonial Practices of Knowledge Building and Academic Freedom, comes at a time when we are seeing and experiencing censorship and a pushback to academic freedom, right to speech and expressions. And as I was saying earlier, we also have a wonderful line of panelists, Dr. Linda Musariri, Amanda Mokone, and Grace Nachako, who will be in conversation with Professor Oyèwùmí, and later we will open up for a Q&A session with you and the audience. So without further ado, Professor Oyèwùmí. Do you need help with that? Can I put that in?
No, I think I'll be fine.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's okay. Balancing acts. It's an honor to be here. And I got the impression that I'm not going to talk for long because I, too, want to hear from you. So probably 20 minutes, 25? Yeah. So let me start with an epigraph. Bryan Stevenson, the African-American social justice activist and law professor. He was the one who created the Museum of Lynching in Alabama. I haven't seen it yet, but everybody talks about it here. Okay? Because people forgot about lynchings, right? Now they won't. Talking about disruptive practices. And so let me start with this epigraph from Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson said, and I quote, "The greatest evil of American slavery was not involuntary servitude, but rather the narrative of racial differences we created to legitimate slavery." End of quote. I read that as the fact that stories matter. And for many of us, it's through the stories we tell that you're being our point of view, our views on freedom, and all sorts of things. So let me start with that. Gender is a system of classification and therefore a mode in which knowledge is constituted. Thus, the focus of gender categories in my work is also about the construction of knowledge. The global context for research and the production of academic knowledge is one in which concepts, theories, concerns are determined by European and American experiences. Consequently, the unequal power dynamics between Africa, because I'm always talking from an African point of view, even if I live in the US, right? I had this critique of white feminists, American feminists, in one of my writings. I said that they're so narrow in the way in which they think because they are like snails. They carry the nuclear family on their backs, so they can't see anything else. Well, I carry Africa, so why? But then if you carry Africa on your backs, it's so huge, and the history is so deep. You have to be broad. That's me, okay? So I carry Africa. Also, consequently, the unequal power dynamics between Africa as one region of the world and Europe and America as another is a huge factor that must be considered when conducting research and producing knowledge about Africa and the world. Since Western categories and concepts are not necessarily transcultural or universal, it became clear to me very early that I had to engage with deeper epistemological issues about identities of scholars, their points of view, and the historical and social context in which knowledge is produced. So in the next few minutes, I identified 3 quick sections
to this presentation, and I hope that during the Q&A, whatever I've left out will come out in the Q&A. In my book, Invention, I expose gender as a colonial category in Yoruba society. Apart from the parochialisms of gender binaries and male-female, boy-girl that Europeans took for granted, I expose the falsity of universalizing three assumptions about females, women, as pillars of feminist discourses. The idea that women are excluded from the public sphere, the idea that women are minors, someone is always in charge of them, and indeed, in settler colonies in Africa especially, they actually instituted that minoritizing of women. And I know it did happen in Zimbabwe, where people will say, oh, you have a boy in the family. The father is not here, he's the head of the family. That kind of thing was instituted based on the way in which they saw gender, which was contrary to many African systems. A mother cannot be in the house and you say a boy is superior or what have you. Then the third is, of course, given the biologic and the deep-seated ideology of biological determinism, social roles are said to be mapped onto bodies. The book Invention challenged the unwarranted universalization of these ideas, showing that none of these assumptions were true of Yoruba society until Western colonization imposed its tenets on the society. In that volume, I showed that gender is not ontological to Yoruba ethos, and thus the presence of identifiable gender constructs in the language, history, social institutions today are evidence of recent social change. Succinctly stated, my thesis is that the presumption of gender and concomitant male dominance in understanding endogenous Yoruba institutions, social practices, and values represents an epistemological shift, and over time, possible epistemicide of its cultural ethos if we do not disrupt. But the fact that gender distinctions were not a part of our ontology did not stop various kinds of Western colonizers' agents, including feminists, from destroying much of our worlds. And I say that because in the next section now I go into what I call who is not afraid of gender. And I am responding to Judith Butler, Judith Butler's recent writing. In 2022, Judith Butler, the renowned feminist theorist and philosopher, gave a keynote address. And the title of her lecture, which has now become a book, is Who is Afraid of Gender? Judith Butler posed the question because serious opposition against the concept of gender has developed in a number of conservative institutions such as the Catholic and Pentecostal churches. What she calls the anti-gender ideological movements are upset about what they see as the enormous power of gender to wreak havoc on the family, destroy traditional values, threaten masculinity and femininity, destroy society, and so on. Butler's question, who is afraid of gender, is directed at the conservative, religious, and secular forces, some academics, who are infected by what she called deep gender anxiety. But it is not only conservative forces that have advanced critiques of gender, but she also points out how gender has been declared a colonial imposition by no less than Pope Francis himself. Immediately I heard that, I said, Pope Francis has plagiarized my work. In that vein, the church seemed to have appropriated some of the long-standing post-colonial critique of gender by scholars and movements from the global south. However, Butler appears to underestimate the significance of such critique when she conflates them She underestimates the quote-unquote decolonial critique when she conflates it with the Pope. And I see some of that conflation, although in her book she tried to pull away from that, right? So she conflates our critique with those of the conservative anti-gender ideology movement championed by the popes. It is Butler's bundling of the conservative critique and the more progressive opposition to gender by post-colonial subjects that led me to pose the question, but who is not afraid of gender? Butler labels the concerns of the anti-gender ideological movement a phantasm, pathologic, overwrought, and an imaginary preoccupation. But the weaponization of gender by European colonizers around the world was no phantasm. Their impact has been devastating for living things, including humans around the world. And I'm saying that gender was one of the tools in the toolbox of the colonizer, the genocidaire, and whatever conquistador, whatever name you want to call them, gender was very much part of the weapon, one of the weapons. And I don't know why Butler was not aware of that. And I'm saying that we should be afraid of gender, and we have been afraid of gender. Around the world, indigenous persons for centuries have been afraid of gender, a colonial category imposed on them through Western domination. The fears that the Catholic Fathers and other conservative forces express about gender today may seem far-fetched, but historically, the imposition of Western racial gender norms and institutions worldwide has had the effect of destroying families and societies. Thus, indigenous people have lived under fear due to imposition, colonization, distortion, and erasure. It is this age-old fear emanating from land dispossession, impoverishment, slavery, and attendant global inequality under the hegemony of white supremacy to which I want to draw attention. In fact, the subject of my decades-long critique of the concept of gender is about the frightful and calamitous negative impact it has had. To critique gender as a concept, as theory, and as practice is to critique feminism, because feminists are one of the most gender-focused constituencies spreading the racial and gender tenets of white supremacy and male supremacy around the world. They are entwined. In case anybody thinks that one is exaggerating the impact of gender, I have examples. And one of the ones I like to give, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but we could, is the work of Dr. Marion Sims, whom they called the father of gynecology. He was operating on enslaved women without anesthesia. One enslaved woman, Anacha, was operated 21 times around her genitalia because he's practicing. Not to talk of the torture of gender and whatever. And whatever his findings are, nobody banned that finding. They call him father of gynecology because when he perfected his surgeries, they said now he was ready to use them on white women to save them, and by that time they had anesthesia. And the statue of Marion Sims was at Central Park till very recently, 2 years ago. And if you contrast that to, of course, some of the scientific findings from the Holocaust, the experimentation with Jews, nobody knows what the results of those things. They were banned. Okay? So just to give you an idea of why people must be afraid of gender, because Judith Butler said, I don't know why people are afraid of it. It's so ordinary. I'm like, ordinary? Have you been looking at history? Okay? So I go to the next section. I've spent how many minutes? So a few years ago, 2 years ago, the book Invention was a quarter of a century old. And one of the questions I was asking, I said, in the quarter of a century since Invention was written, has systemic racism and systemic sexism disappeared? Do African women have more freedom, whether academic or not? Do African women have less to fear from a global racial gender system? Unfortunately not. The derogation and marginalization of African women have only deepened. I hope some people will alleviate my fears. In international settings, Africans are discounted. Our experiences are erased, and the continent is often unaccounted for. That is the story of Africans 25 years after Invention. Consider the experience of Vanessa Nakate, a young Ugandan climate activist. I know some of you must have heard about Vanessa. Her story literally and metaphorically epitomizes the space in which we find ourselves as Africans and indeed as African females. I quote from Vanessa's memoir. Nakate first came into the public attention at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland in 2020, when the AP published a photo of the delegates as part of their coverage of the event. Nakate, the only non-white delegate, was cropped out of the picture. She was with Greta Thunberg and all that, and two other, all white women. I think probably all Europeans, actually. So she was cropped out of the picture. So she's eagerly looking at the picture, and she said, wow, where am I in this? So in her new book, A Bigger Picture, The Fight to Bring a New African Voice to the Climate Crisis, you know these people are teenagers, early 20s. I mean, to think that for the next 60 years, this is what will go on, I don't know. Anyway, so Vanessa chronicles her reaction when she discovered her erasure from the picture. You have to understand that Vanessa is Ugandan, grew up in Uganda. She's not thinking about race. She probably doesn't know she's black. And then, boom, this thing happens to her. Just imagine. And she said, I couldn't believe what I was seeing or not seeing. I'm quoting here now. Within a minute, I came upon a link to an article that features one of the photos that had been taken of us, the climate justice activists. My heart nearly stopped. It was clearly the picture I'd seen. Since you could actually make out the edge of my quote, but I wasn't in the frame. But I was nowhere to be seen. I'd been cropped out. I cycled rapidly through my feelings. I was frustrated, angry, and embarrassed. As I looked at the image, it became impossible to ignore that of the 5 women who had posed for that picture, I was the only one who wasn't from Europe and the only one who was black. They hadn't just cropped me out, I realized. They'd cropped out a continent. I thought that was very eloquent of her. End of quote. Nakate's painful experience of one-on-one racism, unfortunately not unusual, and she understood the breadth and depth of it when she eloquently summed it up. This is not new. Anti-African practices are a way of life in the global system. Why then should we not be afraid of gender? Why then should we not be afraid of the biologic that reduces humans to their bodies, and the other especially, as we found, is supposed to be just a body? But what sort of body is the African? What sort of body is the black body? How many minutes? 5, okay. So earlier I just talked about Dr. Sims here and the horrendous things he did to the bodies of enslaved black women. Angela Davis, the renowned black activist, noted that black women's bodies were treated as anomalies. Unfortunately, the dehumanization and the naturalization of black women's bodies is alive and well in the 21st century. Young African women are definitely feeling the brunt of the white supremacist global system in deeply personal ways. At the Olympics, gender and globalization have collided over the bodies of African women athletes. I am talking about the banning of 2 Namibian women from particular track events at the Tokyo Olympics. I haven't even talked about the recent one. Christine Mboma and Beatrice Masilingi were both 18 and were relatively unknown in international athletics until when they started running fast times, when they were succeeding over 400 meters. That caught the attention of World Athletics and prompted the sport's governing body to order tests on both sprinters in the weeks before Tokyo Olympics. They were found to have unnatural testosterone levels that are higher than a limit set by the sport for female athletes. I can't begin. I hope one day I'll be able to talk to these young women. What crossed their mind? They probably never even heard of testosterone before. I don't know that at 18 I was thinking of testosterone. Test what? I can't run test? What? They would have been flabbergasted. You know? We can talk about testosterone and who said what. I always wondered that if you took a lineup of the men who are running the 100 meters and took their testosterone, do you think they'd all be the same? Nobody's done that. And it seems as if African women especially are singled out as this thing, whether it's testosterone, whether it's what. We saw how Michelle Obama, they said she's in drag, she's a man. We've seen Serena. So it's an age-old story. And one of the things I've said, and I don't want to encourage them to do this, I said if you look at the African continent, it seems as if they just look at all African women. We're a continent of drag, people in drag, because we don't look feminine enough. We don't. But, of course, we gave birth to humanity. That's another story. Why is it that these young persons who have grown up in African families and spaces without ever being treated as abnormal suddenly become stigmatized as soon as they encounter Western institutions? Who speaks for them? Where is the solidarity from the global sisterhood? Earlier and similarly, the Olympics are emblematic of a Western space. Hence, African women suffer without recourse. It is a great metaphor for the state of globalization and the terrible things that are going on. And then, of course, we cannot talk about these 2 younger women, Christine, without talking of Caster Semenya, who preceded them, and how Caster Semenya's career has been derailed, by and large. The Ugandan law professor, Sylvia Tamale, in her book on decolonization and Afrofeminism, said the following, and I appreciate that. Quote, Caster found herself at the intersection of genderphobia, homophobia, racism, and classism. Things would have been very different had such knowledge been situated within the cosmologies of her indigenous African people that are more encompassing and tolerant of non-binary ways of being. Across the continent, there are all sorts of institutions, all sorts of practices that are non-binary, that we don't even know how the language to talk about them because we're not researching that. We've just taken the Western lens and plunged it down. In her article, Spectacles and Scholarship, Caster Semenya, Intersex Studies and the Problem of Race in Feminist Theory. Zinema Gubani writes and writes eloquently, and I quote, "An ambiguously gendered white body," and she's talking about the development of the category of gender in medical practices, even in theory, that the development of gender came out of intersex category, hermaphroditism. And so she writes, an ambiguously gendered white body needed to be corrected to retain its whiteness, whereas an ambiguously gendered black body was seen as confirming the essential biological difference between whites and blacks. Equally important was the need to use surgical correction to further secure the gendered distribution of racially exclusive social privileges, such as the right to inherit and own property. There was the example of somebody in Massachusetts, I think in the 18th or early 19th century, he was menstruating, and then he said, one day, that I'm male, and started dressing like a man. And so there was voting in that community. So he was able to vote. And the people who won the election were happy with him. And suddenly he was able to have access to property. So gender is just not a minor tweak. It has to do with property, acquisition of certain rights, and the like. That's why in the US, they found it necessary to correct the intersex. They find it necessary to have that binary line for white bodies, but not for black bodies, because it was like, what is at stake? You're not going to win property anyway. I'm coming to the end now. According to Sylvia Tamalate, gender as a mechanism of colonial domination over non-white racialized bodies. It was at that historical moment when the West subjugated Africa, introducing its specific sex-gender system, that the everyday lives of Africans were transformed. Their bodies and subjectivities were at once placed under new governing mechanism. The new gender regime controlled bodies, sexualities, and subjectivities, and through institutions such as education and religion, it was internalized by Africans and those that it privileges. End of quote. Gender was never seen as a weapon against women by feminists, by Judith Butlers and all. She said it was ordinary, but was it? We need to disrupt all that. Thank you. So should I sit?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that amazing talk. I have so many comments and questions, which I'll get to. But before that, I would like to ask my dear friends and fellow anthropologists, Linda and Amanda, to please come up. And I'd also like to request our colleague from the Department of Philosophy, Grace Nachako, to also please come up to the stage. These are the disruptors. Should I stand here and ask the question, or should I come? I can go over there? Okay, then let's. Oh, thank you, Grace. All right. So. Yeah, this is working. Wonderful. Before we start, I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to these young researchers. Linda Musariri, on my left, is an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam at the Anthropology Department. She completed the PhD in anthropology at AISSR at the University of Amsterdam. And Linda is interested in understanding power differentials inequalities and epistemological injustices embedded in knowledge production processes, and she employs a critical development lens to research violence, migration and gender and climate change. And then we have Amanda, who calls herself a reluctant anthropologist in training, but I think she's a very good anthropologist, if I may say so myself, is unsolvable existential questions of the tensions between society and science and the impact of this divide on the natural environment and the more than human life forms. Currently, she is pursuing her PhD at our anthropology department, and she's also an African feminist and gender equity enthusiast trained at the African Gender Institute housed at the University of Cape Town, where she spent time teaching the politics of knowledge production in the newly renamed African Feminist Studies Department. And she's a keen mountaineer from South Africa with roots with the, I love this, Kingdom in the Sky, Lesotho. And of course, we have Grace Nachako, who is a philosopher. It's nice to have a philosopher among all the anthropologists, author and translator. She studied political science and philosophy at the University of Amsterdam and at Sorbonne in Paris. She writes for various Dutch publications such as Dipsaus Podcast. I'm going to really mispronounce words. My apologies. De Nederlandse Bogengids, Hard, Hoofd, De Witte Raf, and De Internet Gids. How did I do, Dutch speakers? Yeah, goed? Yeah, goed. And she's also translated major work, Discours sur Colonial. How would you say that? There you go. Yes. Oh, there's the mic. And the poems of Nell Marianne from French to Dutch. Welcome, everybody, to this wonderful panel. I have lots of questions to all of you. So I will start with Professor Oyèwùmí. In your book, The Invention of Women, and I'll just call it in its short form, Invention. You not only problematize Western understanding of gender, but in many sense you completely destabilize these categories, in which you also talked about just right now. And I'm personally enthralled by the way in which you explain the biologic of Western discourse, and hence how the worldview is created with the sense of the sight, and how that is extremely important. Instead? Oh, okay. Whereby, when looking at the Yoruba world building, it is relational. It is of age and social positions. Gender, or rather sex, the gendered body is quite clearly a colonial imposition that acts to control and socially engineer bodies. Yet, in your groundbreaking epistemological and ontological deliberations, the canon still starts from that of the Western theories. The Yoruba, or even the wider Nigerian community, the different languages of Nigeria, and the world building, like so many other post-colonial engagements, come across as an opposition or deconstruction of the West, the global North. Can we ever move past, can we ever be in a time when the Western literature no longer matters? Can we move to a point of post-coloniality when we are no longer oppositional but a world-building process of our own?
Very profound question. Very profound question that has a long history, even with me. Before I wrote Invention, I was asking that question. And I remember I was at a class at Berkeley, one of the few African chemists teaches a class on agriculture and all that. So I seized the opportunity to take that class, and then he said that instead of writing a long paper, that we can use it as an opportunity to produce our proposal that we would send to funding agencies. I said, oh, good, I would need help with that. So I put together a proposal titled Belaboring Women. I was playing with titles before I got to Invention. And I submitted my proposal, and the professor, a white man, said, and we were going to send it especially to the Social Science Research Council. He looked at my proposal, he said, but you have no bibliography. You did not allude to the literature. You must put your work within the context of the literature. And I said, what literature? The literature that makes out Africa to be like that? I said, no, I won't do that because the literature is going to taint my work. That was what I said. And he just laughed and shook his head. He's like, you're not going anywhere with this. So it's that practice, that singular practice, that we must put our work within the you still do that, you still must do that. That is the key. The people who are setting the agenda, but ultimately, this is a question of power. And I remember that one of the ways in which I tried to solve that problem, I said there must be a literature outside of the West. What are the Chinese doing? What about the Japanese? There must be a literature. And I subsequently found out that there was no literature outside of the West at the time. So I had to comply. But invention came out, and it's not a total loss. But I said ultimately, this is a question of power. It's not about academic freedom in the academy. The freedom and everything has to be won outside first, in places where we can create our own institutions. Otherwise, this thing is very elusive. Yeah. But I don't want to depress us all, because it seems as if something survived. The fact that invention was published and people are finding it inspirational, the fact that people are finding it useful, tells me that the issue is not a total either or. And there are people now in this room working who will be able to chart and build, but ultimately it's a question of power, sovereignty, and the ability to control our own self, institutions. Okay?
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, please, Linda. Please do.
Okay, yeah, so I just wanted also to add to that, that it's a question of power, but it's also of profit. And I just wanted, when you were speaking that gender was one of the tools in the colonizers' toolbox, I actually thought of how gender is actually an industry in Africa. And I'm speaking as someone who was working in that world, that there are a lot of NGOs that are working on gender, trying to address gender inequality. And you also asked that since the invention of gender, has the lives of African women, have they improved? And which is a question that I would also ask in the work that I was doing since the invention of gender equality and working as an activist, that one of the frustrations is you wouldn't see any change. And another frustration is that we would not come across the framing of gender like the way you do, though we would see it in the field, that people did not subscribe to the gender equality or the framing of gender that we were doing. But once there was no feedback, like when you go into the field, people tell you that we are giving out female condoms because we need to empower the African women, that they can actually now use the female condoms. But you find that the African women, they don't want the female condoms. And then you tell that, no, this is not working. And then it gets back to funding and the funder, that this is what works. So I just wanted to add that in addition to power, there's also the issue of profit and it being an industry as well.
Don't let go of the mic, because I have a follow-up question to exactly that. Yeah. Oh, should we? Okay. This is actually a great segue to the question that I have for you, Linda, about that of the work that you did on masculinity in South Africa, especially looking at migrant men and really disrupting the concept of masculinity, and exactly what you were saying, that there are these quite ridiculous, if I may say so, ideas of, development sector, rights-based, what is a man, how to make, the African man better, and all of these very value, value-led ideas, right? And you really disrupted all of that with your work and talked about cornering and talking about masculinity. So the thing is that while I completely agree with you, and we have very similar backgrounds of coming from the development sector and then becoming anthropologists, but then we are also going back to these categories. How do we disrupt? And then again, we go back to these categories. How do you deal with this duality on a constant basis?
Okay, thank you, Shahana. So, this is a hard question, I think, for many researchers, the issue of categories, right? Because we see the utility of using the categories, but we also see when they become stereotypes. But what I wanted to... I'm evading your question. And yes, it's actually a question that is related that I would want to ask our professor to say, when you talk of, this understanding of gender that, the pre-colonial, but now where we are right now, we see that maybe we now have gender. Before it was not there, which is the current situation that we are now working with. We have it now because of also over time it has become like a discursive phenomena as well. And people are now performing, acting gender, and now we actually see the gender inequalities, like the work that I was doing, gender-based violence is there. And then I read about your work, and it really resonates with me. It resonates with the work that I'm doing with the participants. But now the question is, what do we do? Because we now have gender as a problem. So, yeah, it's linked to what we were talking about, the categories as well. So I pass it on to Professor.
I'm glad you didn't accuse me of saying that there's no gender or no gender inequality today. I said, well, did you read chapter 3? Isn't that what I'm trying to document? Yeah. But then the presence of the categories of gender did not totally subvert. Yeah. Because today in Yoruba land, you still have seniority. In my family, you still have seniority. And you have gender. My father died 2 years ago. I've said that I have to write a book about this. And we have 3 people who have PhDs in my family. 2 of us were women. My father was very proactive, taking us to school and whatever. So he was troglodyte or anything, very cosmopolitan and supportive. But when we looked at his will and the inheritance, there was this clear gender discrimination against the females. And I said, my brothers, many of them are even richer than us. Why did he do that? But when you also look at his will, there are there are principles, Yoruba inheritance principles also operating in that. In that will. And there are also colonial. All this to say, all these things are present today. And indeed, part of what it also brings to the table is that we cannot always talk about Western and non-Western. As many theorists have said, many of us have internalized the West, right? And indeed, in 1 or 2 of my papers, I say that black African men, elite men, are the inheritors or the benefactors of the colonial system. And it's very much ingrained in the way in which they are behaving. So I think that what that puts on the table is what I will call the multi-pronged way in which we must address questions of inequality and all that. And one of the things I saw lately is that my favorite chapter in Invention was talking about Yoruba monarchy and the fact that females could be kings. Yeah. They call them, instead of kings, they call them queens, but no. I insisted on monarchs and all that. And I was able to show. And then I discovered that I wasn't even the first to show that, right? And I talked about a particular monarch. But lately, I've seen the story circulating on WhatsApp and said that this particular monarch of the 17th century, who was a woman, she underwent transgender surgery. That's what people today. I'm saying that history is not immune from surgery. You get what I'm saying? And so whenever you present work on gender, the people who are benefiting from it have a whole lot of things to say. In Nigeria, for example, people were demonstrating against child marriage. And you have some people say, well, I'm a Muslim. And even the prophet married a child. People will distort whatever they will distort in order to prove their point. And I have reached a stage that whenever we sit down to talk about these issues in our communities, in our countries, in our villages, the question, I don't want to get into arguments about who said this, who said that. I always say the question we must put in front of us, and I think at a global level is a question we must put, what sort of society do we want? And you who are antagonizing me about child marriage, are you going to now look me in the face and say, yes, we should have child marriage and my child too? You know, we have to talk, we have to see how these histories inform the way we approach the question and the strategies. I'm going to stop in a minute. For me, the most important thing that invention brought to the table for Africa is the understanding that many communities, all communities have their own systems of knowledge. Africans had accumulated knowledge. If somebody can get at least that into their head, because once you accept that, then you say, oh, okay, maybe we can look for it. And this seems so trite, but unfortunately it is not. Part of our internalization of colonization is that Africa is erased. We have to look out. That's part of why we accept gender, we accept racialization, we accept, because we're looking to the West. And if we can at least first even stop that and say, let's look at ourselves and where do we want to go with this? Things do not necessarily happen in one fell swoop.
In fact, that's a wonderful note, and that's connected to the question I have for Amanda, in fact. But before I go to Amanda, Grace, I had a couple of questions for you. And one of the things that we had a really lovely conversation about in preparation for this today's event was the power that you look at the power of speech. And not just the words, but famous speeches, lectures, statements that carry the power of change. Narratives are built and recreated based on such speeches and words. And we had earlier, we had talked about the power of these words and also how these words are operationalized in different situations and who's interpreting them, right? And you made this fascinating point, and I'll try to paraphrase you the best I can. Grace is like, wait, I said something, what? No, you did. You said something amazing, which is taking from Frantz Fanon's work that, noir and negre have very different and distinct connotation, whereby noir is a black subjectivity, usually connected to art, glamour. There's a whole concept around it, whereby negre is about subjecting or racializing, especially people. And yet we rely on certain universal languages, such as, for example, I speak English, this is my main language, to communicate. And then but then at the same time, I borrow from Anne-Marie Moll, who says that, English also flattens languages. So how do we then take from different languages, the discursive, the language of the subaltern, to learn from one another? On one hand, English, for example, to me, is both a colonial language, but it is also my mother tongue, unfortunately. And yet, and through this, I get to access this entire massive world as well. So how do we make some sort of a peace with this constant duality?
The duality of that these European languages have.
Yeah.
It's a very big question. It's something that a lot of African writers and Afro-Caribbean writers have struggled with. So, for example, the writers from the Negritude, Aimé Césaire famously said that because he was very well aware as well of the fact that the French language is very colonial, especially for him coming from Martinique, where even though they have been colonized by French, they also have their own language. And but French is still very much the official language in Martinique, and Aimé Césaire has gone through all of the very big French educational institutions, so like places like Lycée Louis le Grand, where all the also very former presidents have studied, and then later to École Normale Supérieure, where a lot of the famous French intellectuals that we know today, like Foucault, Derrida, Sartre, and Simone Weil have studied, and where he has been formally educated in French and has had to learn all of the French canonical classical works. And he said that despite this awareness of this, he tried to create, as a poet, sort of a black French, so to then bring his own heritage and experiences in the French language. But then there's the question in how far this is even possible, of course, because you see that are these works then as accessible to the communities where these writers are from as they are to the people in mainland France, and so it's then also a problem of because he has a very political motivation in trying to create this black French, but can it then also become depoliticized because oftentimes the way these works are then received in France is as purely in an aesthetic fashion. Yeah. So like them just admiring the literary qualities of these works, but then trying to negate the very political project that is also very, very much present in his work. So that's also this danger, and so that's why you have nowadays writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o who then deliberately say like, no, it's not even possible to decolonize essentially these European languages, and it's better to like work from the native language. So like it would be for example in the Congo that would be Lingala, but it would differ per country, and so like Césaire could have written in Creole, like the language that is spoken in Martinique. So, like, then why do you even need to write in French when you already have a language that from which you can write this colonial critique?
Can I follow up and be a really horrible devil's advocate to this point? That, so for instance, the reason why for example, I can read so much, doing something that I'm very passionate about, the South-South knowledge exchange. So much of that happens because of these particular colonial languages. So if we want to come together, do these kinds of collaborations, we're also having to go through these languages that have such horrible histories with us. What do we do? Like, how would we move forward?
I'm sorry, I don't really...
Like, so for example, you know, I know a couple of, you know, South Asian languages, but I do not know more. I mean, I can't say that if I want to learn about what is happening, you know, in the African context, you know, of a particular country, be it Nigeria, be it Ghana, you know, how many languages would I have to learn? Or how many of my languages would you have to learn? Do you see what I'm saying? And unfortunately, we are having to use English. We're having to use French to communicate with one another.
I don't know if that's necessarily the case, because like that's where translators are for, right? Mm-hmm. Because like it's not as if the our current condition is so unique, because I read a lot of Russian literature, but like if you look at like Russia in the 19th century, like they used to. The Russian language didn't used to be a literary language either, right. Because like the Russian elite used to like mostly speak French, read speak and read in French, and write in French, and also English and German. And so like if you read, for example, War and Peace by Tolstoy, you'll notice that there are whole passages in French, because that's Tolstoy Tolstoy indicating that how the nobility used to communicate in French with each other. But then this process of vernacularization happened in the 19th century. So like that's why I said like it's not necessarily a unique problem that we have. And like, but even if I today want to read about the colonial context of like. Of a different writer or thinker from the global South, I still rely on translated works. Because I speak some Spanish, but I'm not fluent enough, and because I haven't practiced it a lot the recent years. So when I read Nicolas Guillen, I rely on translators. Right. But why does it? So like it's. So I still rely on translations. So then it could easily be something that's been translated from Yoruba or Lingala to whatever language you yourself understand. Then yes, it could as easily be from Lingala or Yoruba as from Spanish. So like that's why I don't really necessarily see why it should be a problem.
Right.
But it is. Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
But it is, right? Right? It is a problem. You don't see why it is, but it is a problem, because there's very little being written in African languages. So that problem. Invention has been translated into Spanish, into Portuguese, and I think the next likely one, and I don't know whether it wasn't one of the first ones, is that to be translated into French, because there's an audience in even West Africa, not to talk in French, but nobody has tried to do it. But the Brazilians have embraced it and taken it to the next level. But on the continent, why haven't we done any of this? Why that is the question. But that question, these days, some of it is even more intelligible to me, because I just did an anthology on African names called Naming Africans. And it was during the research on naming that it dawned on me that naming African names is part of the language question. Africans are not even giving themselves African names. And they're talking of decolonization. I said, start with your name.
Just name me.
It was, yeah, because I'm just shocked. So why is that not happening? Because the way I think about African names, I don't want to put anybody on the spot. The question I was asking and I'm asking, especially in the case of Nigeria, I remember years ago I started thinking, okay, colonization is deep, but there are certain things that Nigerians choose when they put the colonial on the table and the Nigerian on the table, they choose the Nigerian. And I'm thinking, what are those things? Food, for one thing. I mean, forget jollof rice. Who is going to put pepper in the food? Am I going to choose? What do the English know about cooking? You know? So we're not confused about certain things. And so I'm always thinking about the choices we make. And when it came to names, why are Africans not choosing African names? You know, it's like, wow. Even something that appears so simple. And then I always confronted people. And then I'll say, okay, even if you didn't choose, you have children? They'll say, oh, yeah. But I've given them an African name. But some people are still perpetuating. And for those of us who want to change things, so-called little situations like that should inform some of what we do. And so Afrobeat is a language. And Afrobeat has succeeded globally in many ways. And one of the most fascinating things I found about Afrobeat, because I'm in the academy, we're debating, when are we going to use our language, whatever. They didn't wait. You listen to one record, they may use 3 different or 4 different languages. Whatever that is worth, it points to certain things, maybe more positive things, right? So some things are succeeding, and I'll stop in a minute. There's a backlash, blacklash, whitelash, worldwide. There's no question. The most obvious one to me, and I think, is Trump and the so-called right wing in America, the idea that you've come to replace them, and the pushback and whatever. And when it dawned on us as these members of the minority group, if you ask me, I said white supremacy is almost total. It's still like 99%, but they're afraid. They are pushing back. I said, what is going on? I think we may be underestimating some of our success. And we ought to look at the little things that are succeeding, because it will enable us go to the next level.
Thank you for that.
This is what.
Because, I know you wanted to say something, but I do have a question for Amanda. Amanda. Yeah. So I do love your work on gender, and yet I love the fact that you do not necessarily call it gender or feminist studies through the work that you do. And it is, but you take a lot of care to bring forward indigenous knowledge and practices from the social community. I tried, and their relationship with water. I personally have such profound respect for the ways in which you care for methodology, because as a Bangladeshi, as someone whose nation is also highly impacted by climate change, I'm constantly wondering why is it that we have such indigenous knowledge globally on how to live with the elements, and yet what translates into transferable knowledge or scientific, or what travels as that, we're still having to go back to very Western methods of doing science and knowledge. So how do you navigate this problem?
Wow. Thank you, Shahana. I'll give an anecdote. So I did not necessarily claim any specific field. I came to anthropology because I really liked the project and what was being done, and not necessarily because of what the discipline does. Then I learned that ethnography is a key feature of anthropology. and realized that this is something that I've always known, but I wasn't calling it ethnography. And in my training back in South Africa, the way that we conduct research is ethnographic, but it's not necessarily titled that. Hence, I steer clear of attaching certain labels to the work that I do, because I am painfully aware of the fact that as an African woman who is Black, whenever I attach such titles or hint at that kind of wording, I'm immediately relegated to being an expert of gender and race. And this does, of course, come out in my work, but I'm not dealing with gender or race thematically. But because I am implicated in the work that I do, and I'm theorizing from the self first, right? Prof said we tell stories, and that stories matter. And the first story, and the only story that any of us have legitimacy telling, is our own stories. And so in extending my access to these canons that claim that there's a knowledge gap, there is no gap. The gap is in our libraries. I bring with me these experiences. And of the Xhosa people specifically, I'm fascinated by the ways in which there are these knowledges that have always existed, but there isn't a need to make it novel. For example, Prof. Zethu Matabeni was here a couple of weeks ago speaking about the idea or the concept of nongaindoda, which we, choosing English, which flattens and pacifies our languages, would call non-binary. Right. This is not a new phenomena. Xhosa people have always known that people come in so many different manifestations. And so with regards to water, I'm aware that people in general in South Africa have multiple ways of relating to the water. Mm-hmm. But to be able to get those stories, to be able to get that information, I need to be critical and be very honest about how I relate to what I choose to call the field. What is my field? Specifically for me, I am not from the Xhosa nation. So I am coming in as an outsider, but one would very easily and very comfortably say, well, I am South African, they are South African, I'm Black, they are Black, therefore Nelson Mandela's Rainbow Nation. But I'm aware that, and this is why I front the fact that I come from the beautiful mountain kingdom of Lesotho, that my relation to water and land is different, multiple but different. And so in the way that I source how people relate to the water, I'm very mindful to always then get to know how they think of themselves and how they position themselves. Because at the end of the day, as a reluctant researcher, it's not just my relationship with data. It's not just data. I'm not going there to source data and then I come back and I analyze. I do all of these, Black as I am, woman as I am, gendered, racialized. Right. And so how I gather the data also honors those commitments that I have towards Blackness, towards womanhood and those kinds of things, where I hope we squarely place ourselves in the so-called fields and critically reflect on who we are. Because if you're not really from certain parts of South Africa, you would not be able to see the multiplicity. I'd be able to just say, oh yeah, people need water. Right. But it's not just for drinking, for example, right? They need water for spiritual needs and that sort of thing. And water is also harboring a lot of waste, spiritual waste as well. And these are things that miss the Western framing of what research is, and they are slightly outside of Western academia's purview, but through African feminisms, for example, I'm able to tap into these spaces. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I know the audience have a lot of questions, so we're going to open it up to the audience for a Q&A session. So what we'll do is I'm going to keep an eye on the time. We will do 2 questions at a time, and then and please do tell us your name,
And so the time is short, but if we don't get to your questions, don't worry. Professor Oyèwùmí will be at Villa Day tomorrow. Doors open at 5 p.m. We start at around 5:30. And there will be a lengthy Q&A session there and a wonderful conversation with Professor Oyèwùmí led by Andrew Makinga, and a Q&A session led by the Sankofa Book Club. So you're all welcome, and there's still tickets.
Thank you. I saw hands over here and also over here. So yeah, thank you so much for helping out. Yeah. Please do tell us your name, yeah?
Yeah, sure. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name's Eliza. I run CNN's gender inequality reporting team, and so your book really conflicted me because I'm normalizing the very thing that is an invention, but I'm glad that everybody has already made their peace with that. My question is, what do we do about the fact that, as you mentioned, there is a raging, growing anti-gender, anti-LGBTQ backlash on the continent now? And oftentimes it is imagined that if we tell people their history, they will let go of certain ideas. But actually we're finding that to not be true, right? The idea that the African family is this cis het norm family, people don't care that actually maybe just their grandparents lived a different way, or the idea that gender identities were more plural and fluid. So how do we respond to this when actually stories about our pre-colonial histories do not seem to be, you know, getting through to people as an effective strategy?
We'll take another question. I can already say a question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Malaika. I'm also Nigerian, from Eastern Nigeria, Igbo. I was very taken away by the whole lecture. I want to thank you, first of all, for being here in this space, for gracing us with your presence. Moving on to my question, very similar to yours, actually, because we have so many notions now of our pre-colonial identities and how we can relate to that, connect back to our roots to actually be within systems that actually benefit us as Africans. But I'm noticing now that, again, a lot of us are now seeing that, okay, people aren't really able to digest these pre-colonial notions. And there's a lot of anti-queerness, anti-transgender, and even now, I feel like that is something that has now caused for a lot of us Africans, especially ones who are identifying a lot with this pre-colonial notion, to kind of stray away from almost the traditional language of things and look more towards a Western way of describing things. So even like the ideas of the word like non-binariness and transgender. And me personally, I guess as an Igbo person, I'm able to identify these words within my history. For example, something like Dike Mwami is an Igbo term for someone a spirit who is not male, not female, but a trans fluid spirit. But that had me thinking, okay, this isn't a language I can necessarily use now. Based on my own capacity, because unfortunately I'm not fluent in Igbo. I know lots of Nigerians, we're not fluent in our native tongues, unfortunately. But I know a huge community of us, especially non-binary Africans, that are very aware of our histories and also have this want for a future. That now can't necessarily use these languages or a Western language. So now I'm beginning to see something like a new language being formed, right? One that isn't necessarily dictated to like the actual writing and literature of the language, but more towards the shared community of the language and shared experience of the language. And what I wanted to ask is, can you imagine this new language? Do you see it as something that could potentially be part of how we can grow and how we can acknowledge our ancestors and also acknowledge the things that benefit us today as Africans?
New language.
So two questions, but very similar.
Well, because of the here and now, what is going on? These kinds of questions that you have asked, I hear that all the time. And people ask them in relation to gender, transgender, and the like. But I'm not getting away with that. I'm not moving away from that. But let me give you another example. The issue of land in Africa. A few years ago, when I was in South Africa, a whole institute decided to go to Zimbabwe to have a conference on the land question. I mean, you know, Zimbabwe, the land question. And I had just started my sabbatical, and I told the organizers, and the director of my institute was one of the organizers. I said, gosh, I have to come. I have to come to this conference. I said, no, you just came. We bought tickets. I said, I must. Please. So I went to Zimbabwe. Of course, I had been in Zimbabwe, so I knew Zimbabwe, and I wanted to see some of my friends, and we're going to talk about land. And the land question is so important in Zimbabwe, of course, because of this and that. And so most of the presenters, established scholars, male scholars, went on and on about how land had been taken away from Africans. They invoked the racial issue and all that. And I said, well, they said, okay, maybe you can have 5-10 minutes to say something because we have to justify why we paid for your ticket. So the small thing I presented, and I'm not sure it really went down well, is that much of what was going on in that room, there was the assumption that African women didn't have access to land. They just took it as an article of faith. So I started my discussion because I knew the scholars, and I know that one of the things Africans like to say to establish their African credentials on the family, for example, there's this definition of the family that came out in the colonial period, and it was that the British asked a Nigerian chief, you know, even that word is problematic. They asked, who owns the land? And that chief, whomsoever, made the statement. In Africa, I told my students, never start a sentence with in Africa, because 99% of the time it's wrong. But I am doing so now. So he said, in Africa, the family owns the land. The collective, the community, the family. And he said, who is the family? And he said, millions who have gone on, become ancestors, they're still there, okay? And millions who are still present, and millions yet to come. That is the family. I mean, imagine telling the colonial, that's the family, right? So I started with that at this. I said, so the question I want to ask before we even start asking these other questions is that you accept that definition of the family, and then you usually couple it with the idea that in Africa land was not owned and what. And then now you add that third leg and say women didn't own property. I said the question I want to ask is that when did women stop owning property? Rather than accept it as an article of faith. So that is something that is in the water we drink, the air that today. Right? That's why all the signs, even in the pre-colonial, that in terms of land was not property. Right? There was a point at which land became property and whatever. And then we're now quarreling about the property. We're not asking how did we get to that. So I'm giving that as one example of the ways in which vested interests, right? We Africans are not talking together. I mean, we're stratified. There are vested interests. Some people want things to go this way. Some people want things to go that way. And so, indeed, we have to find new language. But when I say we have to find, people are inventing new words every day. Afrobeat, Jakpa. Yes. It's going, it's ongoing. And so it's the question of what is being described and who and for what purpose. So I don't want us to think that we have to do a conclave of witches, right? Part of the issue in Nigeria today, people are killing women and children and calling them witches. And they say it's their tradition. So I'm saying, yeah, the problem is deep in all sorts of aspects. But it's about the activism and who will work together. Let me let others speak. Yes.
Thank you for that. We have time for one quick question. I see a hand right in the back over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the lecture and all the contributions. I don't know whether it's a question, mine, or it's actually a comment, but I think we'll figure out by the end. I just want to say, whilst I completely agree with your frustrations with how the concept of gender is lived and practiced today, particularly very white and Western in its practice, but I wouldn't necessarily dismiss the struggle within the African context and also pre-colonially. And I think in our attempt to create a correct history and image of our well-being pre-colonial, I think it's important to tell it in perhaps a correct context, because sometimes we fall into this temptation to overly romanticize pre-colonial Africa. I think there's enough history of categories, particularly within the Southern African context where I come from, of categories of women rising up against sexism, even though the existence of the word gender didn't actually permeate our languages, but the struggle itself existed. So sometimes I'm worried that the lack of the terminology of gender in our language is evidence of there not being the struggle, and therefore we just look at seniority as a line of organization, which I find a little bit inaccurate in the context, at least, of Southern Africa, where I am particularly aware of. So I just want to make that distinction, that the struggle of women has constantly been there, because there's evidence of women from the Ntebeles, the Tswana, the Tonga, rising up to sexism long before the arrival of colonialists. So I think that is that's evidence for me of existence of the struggle, but we just need to tell it in the correct context, not necessarily that the absence of the word itself in our language means that it's an invention. So for me, that's what. And then the second point is perhaps just a comment, because I was struck when you said when you started writing your book, you didn't see any literature. I found that very surprising, particularly because I am aware of a huge volume of African literature on any topic in social science, gender, race, but the problem is it is not codified in the manner that Western journals want it to be codified, and then we forget that literature exists, but not necessarily in the way that the journals here want the literature to be codified. That's why I sort of leaned closely to what Amanda was talking about in the way that she tries to collect the data, because the problem, and in this effort for epistemic disobedience, is that we think of literature mostly as the legitimized way it is produced within European journals. But literature in Africa exists orally. It exists in various forms, village institutions. And therefore, if we shift the narrative from talking about the non-existence of literature at the beginning of your work, but rather the fact that the literature that existed was not necessarily considered legitimate because it didn't appear in journals. So much so that we begin to identify and codify our own literature in a way that actually gives it credence, not necessarily the lack of existence, because I think there's a huge volume of literature in Africa on any subject. And that's what I think we need to sort of correct. I don't know whether that was a question or a comment. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. And it's not that Professor needs me to come to her aid, but then I just wanted to actually respond to it a little bit. So I work on gender-based violence, and I work on public health and in colonial medicine. So what I always tell my students is that Queen Victoria is my best friend because I spend so much time with her. And so the thing is that it is not that the literature isn't there, or that I completely agree with you that there is a tendency for us to over-romanticize the past. But at the same time, if you look at these colonial laws, what that tells us is that this very systematic social engineering that was done and codified, and that does make a massive, it's like a massive break in the history, right? And that does matter. And to go and that kind of decolonial work, we're not done with that work yet, you know? And then in the same manner, when, for instance, my favorite is when, Western academics will go out to the global South and say that, well, this is China or this is Japan. And then it is just taken for granted. But when I say that there's a class element in the way in which virginity is dealt out in Bangladesh, I'm asked, where's social class? Right? I have to prove that there's social class. I have to constantly prove, and then I have to demonstrate, right? So the thing is, this whole world building, while you're absolutely right that there's a lot of literature out there, it might not be that of the Western literature, but it is also who brings those things in. That is also very limited, even till today. Even in areas where a lot of work has been done, it's still being questioned, okay, what's the validity of this, and what is the and we're having to fight for, bringing those, experiences, bringing those materials, and saying that, no, this is also knowledge. That's exactly the epistemological justice that we're trying to do in our work. So I just wanted to say that's something that we also face, yeah.
Let me say something quickly about the romance of Africa. I've heard that before, the whole issue of, you are romanticizing Africa. And I always say that if people accuse me of romanticizing Africa, that is a compliment. That is a compliment because Africa is so demonized and degraded and everything. If I can transcend that and say, ooh, Africa, you look wonderful, it is an achievement. That's number one. Then number two, with regard, anyway, I think your answer about the literature, it's well said. And in my case, my second monograph, What Gender is Motherhood, is actually about a Yoruba divination system. And there's a whole literature, Ifa literature. So 256 chapters, and we don't know how many verses in each chapter. So it's a vast literature. People have compiled Ifa. So I have access to that. I have access to that. And one of the arguments I made in What Gender is Motherhood is the way in which colonization has been written into some of the Ifa verses. And some of the diviners, in fact, I've spoken to diviners. I said, even the Orisha won't agree with you on that, and he starts laughing. Women can do this. I said, when you read Ifa, number one, just by changing the pronouns, he, all diviners, all Babalawo become male. And this is a very valued knowledge system. So if women are not in it, what are the implications? And there's a particular Ifa verse that I took from one chapter. I actually put it in the preface of the book. It was about the struggle between male and female. A gender struggle. This thing was interpreted as a gender struggle. And so some of the arguments I made about the way in which people are looking at Ifa, they're looking at Ifa as if it's the Quran or the Bible and whatever. But Ifa is socially constructed. And you cannot look at all those 250 whatever verses and say they were constructed at the same time. So if you point to an Ifa verse and say, oh, Professor Oyèwùmí, you see, Ifa is so ancient, and they were talking about struggle and between men and women. I said, how do you know when this thing was written, this particular thing? Because we also have verses in Ifa that talk about the coming of Islam to Yoruba land, which tells you that some of it is dated. Yeah. So I want to invite you to look at that other book. I want to say my work is more sophisticated than that, if you allow me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for so many of these great questions and comments. I really appreciate it. And of course, you'll have a lot of time to also talk to all the panelists in our drinks, which is now followed from this panel. I want to again say thank you to Professor Oyèwùmí for your time and your knowledge and for sharing these insights with us. Amanda and Grace and Linda, thank you so much. I would love for more conversations with the three of you and for the audience to also do so. I will give the mic to now Amandla to do some of the thank yous.
Where is the last one?
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so this event was part of the series, The Colonial Scholarly Self-Critique, and made possible by all these wonderful people and institutions you see on the screen: the University of Color, Africadelic, Netherlands Institute for Culture Analysis, the Research School for Culture Analysis, the Humanities faculty made it possible for us to organize with SPY 25, the Philosophy Department gave us made it possible for us to organize and bring Professor Oyèwùmí over. Diversity Forum made the workshop we had this morning possible. Mano a mano, without his force and organization, there would not be a Fila Day tomorrow or a series at all. And Paradiso and Pons Podium for the Podium Quiz. So thank you to all of these. And again, I feel like we are not talked out about this topic at all. I think there were many more questions in the room, so I hope to see you tomorrow. The Sankofa Book Club has prepared a lengthy Q&A session where we can delve in more deeply and more broadly into the professor's work. You heard the What Gender is Motherhood. We will be discussing Naming Africans, about the epistemological value of African names, and all her work. So I hope to see you tomorrow as well. And if you want to engage in the debate of which jollof is better, Ghanaian jollof or Nigerian jollof,
that's the most important question.
Exactly. Huh? There will be food from 5 p.m. and we will shake a leg to False Bad Guy and some really cool DJs. So I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you for coming.